Welcome back, history scholars. We have a very exciting time and event to talk about today, really a whole series of events, a movement perhaps, a time in which there's a lot of new religious movements in the Jacksonian period, one of my favorites to talk about. So Jacksonian America refers to America in the 18 teens, 20s, 30s, into the 40s. And we have already talked about a major religious movement taking place at that time called the Second Great Awakening. And that was certainly moving through mainstream evangelical Christianity. But this is also a time in which there's a lot of new religious movements on the horizon, groups that had not existed before. And because the United States had religious freedom, it did offer the opportunity for a lot of new religious movements to emerge. There's nothing illegal preventing these new movements. And so we'll talk about several of these. We might even do this in a couple of parts. We're going to talk about the Restoration movement of Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell. We'll talk about the Mormons. We'll talk about a group of Adventists called the Millerites, who were looking to the end of all time. We'll talk about a whole series of utopian family movements that was also quite common. Eventually, we'll get to the Transcendentalist movement, something not quite specifically religious, but certainly an intellectual and spiritual movement. So the key here is just keeping in mind, we've talked a lot about politics in the Jacksonian period. We've talked about this overall Second Great Awakening, but there are other religious developments taking place that were significant enough, frequent enough. I think I want to draw attention to them here in this series. So we'll first look at the Restoration movement. And this was a term given to a movement led by Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell. So sometimes the Restoration movement is just called the Stone Campbell movement. Well, we've talked about each of these separately in the previous lecture on the Second Great Awakening. You might recall Barton Stone was there at the famous or infamous Cane Ridge revival. He was a Presbyterian minister who just happened to be hosting this event where lots of different denominations come together and are engaged in this enormous communion service. But there's people camped out and hearing preaching and engaged in prayer and worship, ultimately leading to a communion service. And there's a lot of very Pentecostal kind of physical reactions in those days at the camp meeting. Barton Stone's preaching didn't usually lead to that kind of physical manifestation, but he certainly believed it was real. It was sent from God. It's a true Christian revival. Now, we mentioned Alexander Campbell a little bit there as well, because he's also somewhat connected to the Second Great Awakening, not as directly as Stone, because Campbell really didn't preach for a lot of emotion, and he certainly wasn't a revivalist that would sanction what happened at Cane Ridge. But he certainly was a preacher at that time. He was also originally a Presbyterian preacher. But he ends up leaving the Presbyterian church, and he and his father just have a group of independent churches that just call themselves Christians. Actually, they call themselves disciples, and Barton Stone's group will eventually just call themselves Christians. Now, both of these movements, Stone in Kentucky, Campbell in western part of Virginia and Pennsylvania, neither of their movements really had a strict hierarchy. They don't declare themselves leaders of a new religious movement. In fact, this is where you get the name Restoration movement. Both Stone and Campbell believed we are simply restoring the first century church, the only church there is. they really avoid these other kinds of denominational labels that have come up over centuries and centuries of Christian development. So this may be a new movement of the early 1800s in America, but they are saying we simply want to restore the practices of the first century Christianity, in its purest form. So they're going to avoid these labels like Catholic, or Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, any of these that have developed over centuries of Christianity. And they just say, we're just going to use Bible names to describe our movement, our fellowship. So Campbell did prefer the term disciples, and Barton Stone preferred the term just Christians, but really they were interchangeable. Now, neither of these movements has a hierarchy. They're just independent churches that are kind of loosely held together by the journals that each of these men wrote. Barton Stone had a publication called called the Christian Messenger. Alexander Campbell had a publication first called the Christian Baptist, and then had a second publication that went on much longer called Millennial Harbinger. So people who subscribe to those journals might be part of this movement, but really each of them believe that churches should be independent. There's not any hierarchy. There's no presbyters that say, here's how these several congregations are going to have to operate. They believe in independent congregations, but they are loosely held together by these journals that the men publish, and that's kind of what makes them leaders. But otherwise, they are not, they're not the popes of a new movement. And in fact, they're not even real officially tied together. It's just Barton Stone had friends and associates. He meets with some associates of Alexander Campbell, and they realize we are teaching the same kinds of things. We're both telling people, go back to the New Testament, practice things, try to restore the first century church, simple Christianity. And so they decide, hey, I think we're kind of part of the same movement. We have a loose association. So whether you were a Stonite Christian or your church calls itself a Church of Christ, a Disciples of Christ, those things were really kind of interchangeable in the early 1800s. Now, I'm mentioning lots of things quickly here, but there's a lot here. And it's important because, of course, this movement, this restoration movement, is really at the heart of Oklahoma Christian University. This is the movement out of which Oklahoma Christian or Abilene Christian or Lipscomb University, Pepperdine University, Lubbock Christian, all of these sister schools, they come out of this restoration movement history, specifically the group that ends up just being called the Churches of Christ. But that gets ahead of us a little bit. We're not to the point of establishing universities or Churches of Christ being separate from First Christian Church or separate from Disciples of Christ. All those were interchangeable names in this very fluid Jacksonian period, 1820s and 30s. So something else that was really emphasized, that really made this group different, Alexander Campbell, when he left the Presbyterian Church, because he did not agree with their oversight, not letting every congregation be completely independent, he was associated with Baptists for a while, because when he had a child and was to the point where it might be time to baptize an infant, he really, through his study, had determined infant baptism was not biblical. He thought baptism really should be for a believer, someone old enough, whether they're truly adult, old enough to know what they're doing and choosing to be baptized. So he gives this 7-hour sermon, while instead of baptizing his newborn child, he is going to, in fact, be rebaptized. And so he's explaining to everyone um, his study on baptism. He believed baptism was for the believer, not for infants, and it is for the forgiveness of sin. It wasn't simply a ritual to go through that adds you to the church. I mean, it does do that as well, but he thought baptism is for the forgiveness of sin. So this was part of his teaching on baptism. He's part of a Baptist association for a while, but that wasn't exactly how they taught baptism either. Um, Baptist churches did not say, without baptism, there is no forgiveness of sin. They simply rejected infant baptism. So it's never a real comfortable place for his movement. His first publication is called A Christian Baptist, but he's not really going to be a Baptist that fits in with them, the rest of them, very well for very long, because his teachings on baptism really made baptism even more essential than Baptists did. He was teaching this is what adds you to a church. This is what brings you forgiveness of sin. Now, he and Baptist often argue about this because, from a Baptist perspective, it sounds like Campbell is emphasizing that baptism is a human work that earns you salvation. Campbell would deny that. He would say, no, this is not a earning your salvation. It's still God, of course, that does the saving. But throughout the New Testament, anytime someone was converted to Christianity, they're always baptized. It goes together. When people hear the word, they act. Their faith moves them to this action, and this action is a reenactment of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And so, that being buried in baptism and raised up as a new person, that's real central. So Campbell makes it clear he's not condemning anyone who has not reached this conclusion, but he did think when people are taught better, if they really are going back to what the New Testament teaches, baptism is essential. It's not a sprinkling of water. It's not something done to infants. It's something that believers do to be added to the church and to have their sins washed away. So Stone and Campbell each independently have their own movement, really, but they're loosely tied together because they're teaching similar things. Now, again, Barton Stone was more a revivalist, or at least that's how he comes on the scene at Cane Ridge, as one promoting revival. And he gets in trouble for that. We might have mentioned before, Presbyterians were not very happy that at Cane Ridge things got so out of hand, this Pentecostal kind of manifestations of people falling on the ground or yelling out or barking or rolling on the ground. That wasn't the kind of decorum that the Presbyterians wanted in their churches. And in fact, Presbyterians are really trying to avoid the kind of excesses that happened in the first Great Awakening back in the colonial period. So Barton Stone and others associated with him were reprimanded by the Kentucky Synod. That would have been their ruling over several Presbyterian churches. But Stone and his cohort decide to just leave the Kentucky Synod instead and just reject their authority. Say, we've created our own presbytery. We've got several Presbyterian churches, and we govern ourselves now. And after a little while doing that, they end up even breaking up this new presbytery. They called it the Springfield Presbytery. And Stone now and 5 cohorts decide to write the last will and testament of this Springfield Presbytery. And it's a really interesting document. What they're saying is that even though these churches are strong, they're growing, we are disbanding this presbytery because every church should be independent. every church is governed by its own appointed elders. There's not some authority somewhere else that appoints a priest or a pastor. It's the congregation itself that does that. They choose elders. Elders set the tone spiritually and organizationally, or we could say ecclesiastically, for these churches. So they kind of in a sarcastic way say, we are breaking up our very healthy presbytery organization, and we're welcoming all presbyteries to do the same thing. Will yourself to die, because the New Testament really just teaches independent congregations. That's what their conclusion was. So Stone's revivalism had led him to also create an independent Christian group. Now, not all of that cohort really stayed together. Some of them ended up joining a new religious movement called the Shakers, who were celibate. Others regret what they had done earlier and they drift back into the Presbyterian church. Stone, though, and one other friend stay on this independent path and say, we're just going to call ourselves Christians, and we're just going to try to do things the way we read them in the New Testament. Now, I mentioned Campbell was not as much into revivalism. He's much more into intellectual debates. He would rather appeal to people's intellect than just their emotion. He doesn't really trust emotion too much. Now, he is still a preacher, but he really gets famous as a debater. He engages in several different kinds of debates. Probably his most famous is a debate against an atheist or an agnostic, at least someone who doesn't believe that you can know anything about God, named Robert Owen. And Robert Owen had a plan of socialism he thought would help humanity much more than any organized religion. And Alexander Campbell takes his challenge to debate Christianity with him. So in that debate, the Robert Owen debate, Campbell is just representing all Christians and defending the truth of Christianity against a non-believer. He also had several debates with Presbyterian preachers. Those would be on more specific doctrinal issues. They'll argue about baptism. They'll argue about the organization of the church. He would also have a debate against a Catholic minister. He's going to argue that Catholicism is not the church. Catholicism really had corrupted Christianity, and the church, the one that's really being like the New Testament first century church, is his own movement, is the independent Christian or disciples movement. So understand, Campbell appeals to a lot of people and gets a wider audience through debates and through his journal publications. The Christian Baptist that he published from 1823 to 1830 was very combative. It just kind of blasts out at lots of different other teachings, lots of other denominations out there, pointing out what they were doing that's inconsistent with Scripture. Some people thought, this guy's just so into fighting, arguing. He's like an Ishmaelite. His hands are against everyone else, and everyone's against him. Using an Old Testament reference that he's wildly debating against anyone. Now, his later publication, Millennial Harbinger, comes in 1830, and he prints it to the end of his life, and it'll carry on even beyond his life after the 1860s. But that might have been toned down a little, but he still was quite combative against a lot of other Christian denominations. Again, he doesn't quite go so far as to condemn all other churches, but he's going to point out what he thinks is not consistent with New Testament teachings about how those churches are organized or what they teach about baptism. And this is one of the reasons he clashes so much with the Baptist he was associated with briefly. Um, you know, the Baptists still really revered the Ten Commandments. And Campbell's view was the old law, including the Ten Commandments, no longer apply. Jesus died to, Jesus' death, his sacrifice, did away with the old law. And now there's a new covenant, new law under Jesus. So, things that Jesus said explicitly or examples we have of what the New Testament did, those are the principles or the patterns we must follow. But nothing from the Old Testament, although it's good for teaching, it's not directives to us now as religious teaching. The Ten Commandments, those principles were still brought over into the new law. You still aren't supposed to murder, but things like keeping the Sabbath holy. For Alexander Campbell, there is no such thing as a Christian Sabbath. That's a made-up concept over many years of Christianity. God did not say in the New Testament, you're going to preserve Sundays now the way you used to preserve Saturdays, the Sabbath. Campbell thought that's just trying to hold on to the old law. And if you're going to try to hold on to one piece of it, the Sabbath, why not try to keep all of it? Where's the animal sacrifices? Where's the temple, the altar? You can't pick and choose what parts of the old law are going to continue. He believed all of it had been fulfilled with Jesus. So lots of things we could say about this. I love talking about Barton Stone, Alexander Campbell. We're just scratching the surface here. But in summary for this movement, keep in mind, both of these men, their movements had two ultimate goals that are going to clash against each other. Both of them really hope for Christian unity. Now, neither of them is going to say, we're just adding one more denomination out there. No, they will deny that they are a denomination. They're simply restoring the first century church. They're avoiding any denominational names. We just say Christians or disciples, words that you find in the New Testament. They hope to find unity. They want other Christians, Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, they want them all to read, and hear what they're saying, and that we would finally have Christian unity. That more and more people would realize the church is one. God's church is not divided into dozens or hundreds of different groups. Now, they may have independent congregations, but we all have one teaching. Now, Stone hoped that unity would just come through us understanding that we all have the Holy Spirit. We may have some differences of opinion on interpreting Scripture, but we can find unity in the Spirit. Campbell is the more intellectual here, and he would say, there's a set of principles people need to understand intellectually. When you read the New Testament, if you read it without bias, without preconception, just a good, clear, common sense reading of the New Testament, we're going to find a lot more agreement. But they both really emphasize we're going to have this unity, or they hope. But they also both emphasize we're doing things like in the original primitive way. We're going back to the New Testament. This is one of the reasons Alexander Campbell and his movement would discourage the use of instrumental music in worship. It didn't happen in the first century. It doesn't happen until several centuries later. And so, Campbell, trying to follow the primitive example that's found in the New Testament, would say it has nothing to do with worship under the new covenant, because we don't have example of it in the first century. The apostles don't authorize it. They don't practice it. So along with unity, both of these men are also emphasizing the purity of following the primitive patterns of the New Testament church. Now, the way those two principles are going to collide, though, and make it practically impossible to achieve both, is how are you going to get unity if we're going to disagree on some of what the New Testament says um, about their practices or how we interpret Scripture. Um, there have been Christians for a long time and practiced for a long time that have baptized through sprinkling, who've baptized infants. But now Campbell's movement is saying, no, baptism is an immersion in water. That's what the word means. Uh, Baptism, it's a burial in water. How are you going to have unity if you have polarizing views on certain doctrines like that, like baptism, or the place of the Ten Commandments, old law, new law? This is part of the irony here. Neither of these men really ever set out to create more division in Christianity. They weren't simply seeking to add one more choice out there, let alone three more choices. But over time, that's what's going to happen. This is not going to, it'll bring in certain people, it'll bring some people who were Baptists or Presbyterians or Methodists. There will be some that are attracted to this movement, but it doesn't end all those other groups either. It doesn't ultimately provide all unity for all Christians. It is going to add to the variety of religious groups out there, especially in America, with churches of Christ, disciples of Christ, the Christian church, and all those really kind of go separate ways and mean separate things as we get into the later 1800s and early 1900s. But there's a lot here very important about this movement in the Jacksonian period. They give a lot of faith and credit to common people. You should be able to read Scripture and understand what it means, understand what your obligation is. But it's ultimately not going to lead to unity of all Christianity in America. Okay, another new movement to talk about. And this is another movement that would believe that they are restoring the original church. That's the Mormon movement, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Here's the summary. Picture here, this is Joseph Smith. Smith was a young man growing up in upstate New York at the time of the Second Great Awakening. So around him, there are great revivals led by Baptists and Presbyterian, Methodist, and those were the dominant groups where he lived. And he didn't really know who's right. The Bible only describes one church, but which of these groups is the true church? His mother was very religious and she would attend these revivals. His father, though might have been personally spiritual, he's not really ever attached to any particular religious movement. So Joseph Smith says, as a young man, he prayed to God that God would show him which of these groups, Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, which group is right, which one should he join? And he says that God answered his prayer, answered his question, and said, D, none of the above. Well, he didn't literally say that like a multiple choice, but God tells him in this vision that none of these churches really have the authority of God's church. They're all man-made institutions. So that was supposedly Joseph Smith's first encounter with God, first vision of God. But he claims he has others. A few years later, an angel shows up in his bedroom speaking for God. And this angel's name was Moroni. And Moroni was an angel, but he's the ghost, really, of a person who used to live in America. And Moroni tells him that that there are some special plates, some special records of God's people in America that are buried. And when Joseph Smith is proven worthy, then God will allow him to open up these plates and start to translate and reestablish God's true church. Now, some years are going to go by before Joseph Smith is proved worthy to open these and see these golden plates. But ultimately, what's going to be in there, what Joseph Smith claims, no one else can see these plates. He keeps them hidden. Now, he will later say that other witnesses were able to, see them once, and they signed saying, yes, we saw the plates. But only he has the plates in a bag, and he looks in the bag, and then he will translate what's supposedly written in there. So depending on what a person believes, either this is a miracle and Joseph Smith is translating God's word, the record of God's people in America, or he's a charlatan, but a very crafty one, and he can make up a story really well, and be very patient about carrying through this lie as he goes. So anyway, this is his claim. He started to translate these plates, and ultimately those plates are going to become the Book of Mormon. He's translating something that was written in, he says, an ancient Egyptian dialect, and he doesn't know this language, but only through a miracle God is enabling him to read it, translate. What is the Book of Mormon? What is the storyline? The basic storyline goes something like this. It's the story of a man named Nephi who left Israel. He was an ancient Israelite, but Nephi and his family, they get out of Israel just before Israelites are carried off into Babylonian captivity. So this would be, roughly 587 BC, somewhere ancient Israelite who escapes just before Babylonian captivity. And Nephi and his family get on boats and they come all the way to America. So here in the Americas, they continue to try to be faithful, God-fearing people. But some of his sons will be more faithful than others. The storyline is basically broken between two different branches of the family. I've said Nephi, but really that's the son. It should be Lehi is the father, but Lehi's son Nephi is the good son. So the Nephites are always going to be the righteous one, or at least the more righteous ones. He has another son named Laman, Lehi's son Laman, not such a good guy. He's always rebelling against God, and his descendants are always rebelling against God. So for most of the Book of Mormon, you have the Nephites, the people who are pretty good and whose leaders usually are trying to follow God, versus the Lamanites, the evil, rebellious group. And the Book of Mormon is just a series of centuries, supposedly centuries of fighting between these two groups. There is, for a while, there's a stop in the fighting because Jesus comes to America. Now, this is supposed to be after Jesus had his whole birth and life and ministry in Israel. After his resurrection there, he comes to America to let people here know who he is. And he doesn't have to reenact the death, burial, and resurrection. He just already comes back glorified and is going to choose apostles again. He'll have 12 special apostles in America, but it's going to bring temporary unity between Nephites and Lamanites. But after Jesus leaves again, then over time, there'll be corruption once again. The Lamanites will drift away once again, and the fighting will continue. And so, according to this story, the Nephites, the good guys, have continually dwindled until really Moroni was almost all that was left. Moroni was the last survivor that received these plates, because Nephites have been recording their story all along, telling what God has done. And Moroni's father's name is Mormon. So this is a Book of Mormon. Mormon has passed it on to Moroni. And now the ghost, Moroni, is saying, Joseph Smith, I can tell you where my father's plates were. Okay. That's the basic storyline. There is one other ancient people that are talked about in the Book of Mormon, because in the Book of Mormon, the Nephites even find some really ancient manuscripts. They find the works of a group of people called the Jaredites. And the Jaredites are supposedly ancient people who left the biblical world way before Babylonian captivity. They left at the time of the Tower of Babel. So, they left in early part of Genesis, chapter 11. So the Jaredites, they also live and, have some that follow God, some that don't. So, there's kind of even a story within the story in the Book of Mormon. Now, as I said, Joseph Smith translates this, word for word, just one word at a time. It was a very slow process. Sometimes his wife acted as a scribe. She would write down what he would instruct. Sometimes it was a man named Martin Harris. Martin Harris makes the mistake of sharing about 100 pages of what he had translated, and then, having those pages taken away, lost. And then God says, because you have shown people too early, I won't let you retranslate those parts. Now, again, depending on if you're a Mormon believer or not, a believer would say, yes, this was a true punishment from God. He wasn't happy that they showed these pages early. The skeptic, though, would say, this is quite convenient. If Joseph Smith never retranslates those 100 pages, then he never has to make sure it's accurate if those 100 pages show up again. He can just be making up kind of the same gist of a story he was making up before. But Martin Harris translates for a while. There's a guy named Oliver Cowdery that will join. Several different people will be his scribe. While this is a very, very small movement, it's mostly his family and very just close associates who believe that he has this special spiritual connection. But in 1830, this Book of Mormon is published. And one of the first readers and critics of the book is none other than Alexander Campbell. Campbell, in fact, ends up losing some of his associates to this movement. Campbell was very critical of the Book of Mormon. Campbell did not think that this is the work of hundreds and hundreds of years of ancient Native Americans passing on their story. That's what it claims to be. But Campbell says, this sounds like the work of one man, because every part of the book sounds exactly like every other part of the book. It's not like the Bible is very varied. You read Psalms, it sounds very different than Proverbs, which sounds very different from Genesis or Malachi, Matthew, Acts. There's such a variety of writings because there's such a variety of voices in the Christian Bible. The Book of Mormon sounds much more like the work of one person throughout. Now, it is translated by one person. That might be the counter argument. But Campbell did not believe that this was any sort of collection of holy writings from the past. Of course, he's going to ridicule the whole idea that Jesus was risen from the dead, he ascended into heaven, and then he had an American tour after that. Campbell is going to blast this book and say, it just happens to conveniently try to address every big theological argument right now of the 1820s. How convenient. But still, there will be some who will believe, and Joseph Smith's movement will grow a little bit. The main first win he had was actually attracting a man from Ohio, um, a man that had been associated with Campbell, a preacher named Sidney Rigdon. Sidney Rigdon was already part of Campbell's restoration movement. He's interested in restoring first century practices. And he meets Joseph Smith, he reads the Book of Mormon, and he thought, this is a better restoration movement, because Campbell is also talking about Christians having all property, all things held in common. Sounds, like Acts chapter 2. Now, Alexander Campbell would say that was not instruction for all Christians from then on to have no private property, to share all goods exactly in common, like a big socialist commune. But Sidney Rigdon was already captivated by Joseph Smith, and his whole congregation joins them. So it's not just one or two people added to the family. This is a congregation of 100. So Kirtland, Ohio becomes the headquarters for the Mormon movement for a while. But Smith continues to get revelations. The Book of Mormon is supposed to be, what God was doing through the Nephites and Lamanites centuries ago. Joseph Smith, now as the new leader of this restored church, continued to get revelations that would say, this is what God is telling the restored church what to do. So, he would also have 12 apostles. He's going to be the president of this church. That's the term they would use for it. And he continues to get revelations. New revelations say Missouri is the place where God is going to gather all of his people. So the Mormons, as they are missionaries and they are converting other people, really make Missouri a centerpiece of where people are going to start to gather. Now, they still have a community in Kirtland, Ohio, but more of them are starting to move into parts of Missouri. But they really antagonize their neighbors there. Other Missourians do not like the Mormons. They think they're a threat, not only because they have this very peculiar kind of religious teaching, but also because they do kind of act as a group, as a block. They share property in common. They vote as a block. They can really swing an election in Missouri, at least in their county, by saying, we're joining the Democrats or we're joining the Whigs on this issue. And other folks in Missouri really resented that Mormons can move into a community and really take over because they act in unison. So in Missouri, they're going to face a lot of persecution. They're going to face war. Ultimately, they're driven out of several communities in Missouri. And Joseph Smith, he's really kind of going back and forth between Kirtland, Ohio, and some of the settlements in Missouri. At one point, he almost drowns as he's traveling. A new revelation will say that God doesn't want him traveling by boat when he's going between the two. Again, believers may say that was just a very smart, safe thing to protect the leader. The skeptic may say, what a convenient revelation now to get after your boat overturns and you almost drown. No more traveling on boats. Well, Joseph Smith would try to get the government, get the federal government to redress their grievances here. He even writes a lot of the prominent politicians we've talked about in here. He's going to write Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, anybody who's a potential presidential candidate, to say, look, this is what's happened to my community in Missouri. They've been deprived of their property. We're driven out. We should be compensated. We should be able to go back into our homes. People ought to be prosecuted. Most of them will either dodge the issues or ignore, or just say, this is really a states' rights issue. Let Missouri handle it. He's not very satisfied. So eventually he'll have to run for president himself. Joseph Campbell was the candidate in 1844 for the presidency. But by then, he had gathered most of his people in Illinois. The Kirtland, Ohio group really leaves in the midst of um, an economic panic, and they had created a bank. Now, they didn't really have permission by the law of Ohio to create a bank, so they just call it an anti-bank, but it loans money. It prints bills and loans money. So they leave really in the midst of this economic turmoil, owing a lot of people money, but they will come to build a new community in a place called Nauvoo, Illinois. Nauvoo just means a beautiful place. And they really start to gather quite a few. You know, their missionaries have been very effective. And somehow in America and even in England, they've had missionaries go international. Many people are convinced this is what they're looking for in religion. So Nauvoo ends up being a town of over 10,000 people. It's a significant religious movement. Ultimately, while they're in Illinois, though, they're going to start practicing things and teaching things even a little more peculiar than they had before. You know, the further west, the further isolated the Mormons went, the more different and peculiar they seem to become in their teachings. Now, there's rumor that Joseph Smith is teaching plural marriage. You know, that a man can be married to more than one wife. It happened in the Old Testament. It's never condemned. It's going to continue under Joseph Smith. He will, in fact, take on several wives. Sometime, you know, actually physically have multiple wives. Some of the marriages are supposed to be just spiritual marriages, where there's no sexual consummation of the marriage, but a lot of women, of course, want to be attached to the prophet himself, you know, the president of this restored church. Now, this does kind of bring a rift between him and Sidney Rigdon, one of his closest associates, because Sidney Rigdon's daughter is one of his plural wives. Rigdon starts to question, you know, just how holy is this man speaking for God. So that was a new teaching, plural marriage. Also, in a funeral oration that Joseph Smith gives, he teaches in this man's funeral that he's trying to make people feel better. You know, this man that's dead, he's not really dead for good. He's going to go on into the spiritual realm, and he will rule other other realms. He will have, you know, people of his own. Joseph Smith teaches in this funeral speech that the person, the being that we call God, was once a man, and man will someday be like gods. They will also populate these future worlds, and they will oversee future people. Now, that was a peculiar teaching, that God is not the only God. God was a man in some other God's universe, and he's a great man, and he becomes, you know, divine. So this is a peculiar teaching of these Latter-day Saints, that they too can go on to populate future worlds. Now, when some of these new teachings are questioned and they're criticized even by the Nauvoo press, a paper in Nauvoo, Joseph Smith's going to have that press shut down. And that's going to get other people in Illinois, that's really going to get their blood boiling. They're upset. This is America. You can't silence the press because it criticizes you. You know, a religious leader or no kind of leader, you can't just silence opposition. It seems like that's what's happening in Nauvoo. So now, much like in Missouri, there's lots of anger about Joseph Smith. Just what kind of religious leader is he? Just what exactly is he teaching? And how much control does he have over the people there? So Smith wanted to avoid another all-out war between his people and residents of the state, like what happened in Missouri. He wanted to avoid that, so He turned himself in eventually, he and his brother Hiram Smith, and they're taken to jail. But while they're in jail, a mob breaks into the jail and just shoots them both in the prison. Joseph Smith is killed. He's a martyr to this cause. Now, there's other kind of crazy new religious movements in America, and it could have been very, you probably would have predicted at this point, with Joseph Smith gone, this movement's going to die out. But the remarkable thing is it did not die out. Many people still believe Joseph Smith was a prophet. He's not there in person to question anymore, so the legend grows even bigger. And some of his followers will just keep the movement going. Now, there's a little bit of tug of war about who the next leader is going to be, because there are people like Sidney Rigdon who have already started questioning some of his later practices. The Mormon movement splits into different directions here, but the core of the movement is going to be led by a man named Brigham Young. And Brigham Young will say he's the new president. There's still 12 apostles now, and he will be a master organizer of getting these thousands of people to move from Illinois to somewhere more remote. Just move away from these Americans who still don't really understand and who are still hostile to this religion. So this gets a little bit ahead of us, but Brigham Young is going to organize the migration of Mormons from Illinois out into the West, eventually to what we would call Utah now. Now, if you're driving across the country and you get to Salt Lake City, before there was a city there, you would not think, we have arrived, this is perfect. Now, it's got some beauty, but it's desert. And a salty lake is not one you can really drink from. It's going to be very difficult, but that's specifically why Brigham Young chose this place. It's not going to be a place that other Americans are going to flock to. So the Mormons have chosen a very remote place where they can carry on the religion without interference. When they're in Utah, of course, the plural marriage thing is going to really take off quite a bit more. This is in the 1840s. Now, the plural marriage, that will actually officially end. There'll be a new revelation to the president that says we don't do that anymore as of 1890. There will still be some Mormons that said, I don't believe that new revelation. The Mormons have broken into a few different spin-offs too, but the core of the movement has grown into one of America's really large, significant groups. Quite a remarkable story here from its very humble and persecuted origins in 1820s, 30s, and 40s. For time's sake, we'll pause here. I'll make a second part on religion to continue these thoughts, but I think we've spent enough time just talking about Restoration movement and then Mormons. So I'll pick up another part soon. See you soon.